Yep, we're talking about a new Super Mario Bros. Game again, but this time for even longer than usual. Welcome to episode 2 of Creating the Best Sequel, a show where we aim to take a deep dive into the design of our favorite games and discuss what could be done to create the greatest sequel possible. Today, we're taking a look at the newest installment in the new Super Mario Bros. Series, New Super Mario Bros. U. It's already obvious that most people aren't huge fans of this game, for many reasons that we'll discuss soon enough, and it's widely regarded as one of the most uninspired Mario games to date. But do those claims hold up well after a second look today? Probably, but let's talk about it anyway. Mario U starts out roughly the same as the previous entries, with everything seeming perfectly fine and dandy in the Mushroom Kingdom. It even looks like they reused the premise that it was Princess Peach's birthday from the Wii entry. And then, big surprise, Bowser and his oddly large number of children show up and ruin everything, picking up and chucking Mario and his friends miles away before they snatch up Peach for the usual kidnapping routine. There's really nothing new to see here. It's basically the same concept as the Wii entry, but now in high definition. The gameplay is also essentially the same, with the only new concept introduced being the Acorn suit, which allows the player to transform into a flying squirrel with various abilities that make mid-air movement easier to manage. It's a cool power-up, sure, although a little overpowered if used correctly, but it's just about the only truly new mechanic added for this entry.
That's not the only thing they added. Look, the coins can move now.
Because of this, the game starts to feel like more of an extension of the previous one and not a true sequel. And after 4 consecutive extensions essentially, you can only imagine how repetitive and uninspired it starts to feel. The first thing I want to mention is the level design, and honestly, this game's level design is some of the best in the series. Personally, I saw it trying new things way more often than the previous games, and some interesting level concepts and gimmicks kind of impressed me at times. But this more inspired level design is a little more few and far between than I would have liked it to be. The cool setups and challenges came much more as a surprise than an expectation when I came across them, though noticing that made me suspicious of something. Whenever these cool setups were introduced, they were almost always either in an optional level or a challenge for a star coin. Every main level or challenge was uninspired by comparison, and it makes me wonder if the development team was restricted in their creative freedom. It really seems to me that they were yearning to put these cool mechanics and concepts everywhere and in every level, but they may have been severely limited by their creative directors, possibly because they thought it made the game too confusing, which doesn't really track anymore. Video games have been around for a long time, so long in fact that things that may have been confusing 20 years ago are just not confusing to the average player now. We've seen plenty of other games experiment with more advanced level design and benefit greatly from it. It's always interesting to see mechanics and concepts in a game if they're introduced correctly, and I would love to see the next 2D Mario game take that exact same approach. It seems like the developers tried to cater to the casual audience with this entry, but took it way too far, dumbing down the game to a point where it may be too simple. It would be best to give each level something new to the 2D Mario series in a potential sequel, keeping the player on their toes and anticipating what cool new challenge could come next. Most of the level gimmicks used in this entry are either reused from previous games or so bare bones that it barely feels like a gimmick at all. And sure, a level doesn't have to have a gimmick to be good, but in my opinion, I find way more enjoyment in levels with a direct focus on evolving a new and unique concept, rather than ones that rely on recognizable platforming elements for simplicity's sake. That may work in the very beginning of the game, just to let the player get a feel for the controls and figure out how to play, but after that, innovation needs to come, or boredom will come instead. Speaking of boredom, I also want to talk about the difficulty in Mario U. The level design remains fairly simple and mind-numbingly easy for the majority of the first half of the game. Real challenges didn't really ever come up for me until about halfway through the 5th world, and challenge is still an understatement at that point. I felt like the game was holding my hand for way longer than it needed to, and it was becoming difficult to keep playing because of how much interest I had lost, due to how little trouble I was actually having in progression. If the developers were to keep the difficulty at the very beginning of the game relatively the same, but started to increase it at a much earlier point, and at a steady pace, I feel like the overall feeling of the difficulty curve would be much better. Honestly, when I started to be challenged around the beginning of World 6, it sort of felt jarring how fast the difficulty shot up. I've said this before, but a linear or slightly exponential model for difficulty works way better than one that looks like a mountain range. Everyone's favorite bosses also make a return in this entry, the Koopalings, which are Bowser's kids that are somehow even more useless than his first son, who happens to be the only one that actually bears any resemblance to his father. Also, who's the mother? Are they from separate mothers? What is Bowser not telling us? Okay, I'll stop. My point is, the Koopalings have appeared in the last 2 entries to the series, as well as Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World, basically acting as the bosses at the end of each world in every game they are in. For the most part, their fights are very similar between each game, and even when they are a little bit more interesting, they become completely invalidated by how easily you can exploit the fight and beat them in well under 30 seconds. There should be at least some sort of invincibility period between each phase of the fight, so that the player can't just jump on the boss every time they get up. The same thing happens with Boom Boom, who is also a recurring boss in this game, as well as previous ones, and usually acts as a tower boss about midway through each world. Once again, each fight is extremely similar to the last one, and in this entry, even when it gets a bit more complex and Boom Boom grows wings, you can also exploit the fight just as you would all the others. And they already used the exact same idea all the way back in Super Mario Bros. 3, which released, like 32 years ago? A couple of boss fights did push for at least a little bit of originality though. For example, the second tower in World 6 features a battle with a powered up Sumo Bro, who you have to knock off a platform by striking them from below while avoiding their shockwaves of electricity. The fight itself wasn't super difficult or interesting, but at least it wasn't Boom Boom. Also, you have to fight Bowser Jr. a few times throughout your journey. The first battle takes place underwater, where you have to redirect Torpedo Teds to aim back at him to deal damage. The second time you fight him though is by far my favorite boss fight in the entire game. In this battle, Bowser Jr. throws out bob-ombs towards the player while flying above in his Koopa car. Afterwards, he'll try to throw punches towards you with mechanical arms, some of which get stuck in the ground. The player must then walk up the extended arm that is stuck in the ground to damage Bowser Jr. This boss fight isn't even super complex or difficult either. It's just more advanced than jump on their head to win. And that's all you really need to do to make a boss fight at least a little enjoyable. If you really think about it, every Koopaling, as well as Boom Boom, are essentially the same boss, besides the abilities they possess and the small variations in how they look. We all know the drill now. Crush their skull 3 times and move on to the next world. So fun! Like, please, just give me a little more depth. And no, I didn't forget about the final boss fight. It's also fairly unique, and I definitely hadn't seen it before, at least in a Mario game. And it definitely is the hardest boss fight in the game, but my point still stands. None of the other bosses even got close to this one anyway. At least the development team knew that the game had to end with a bang, and they did that well, so I'm glad they at least accomplished that. Obviously, the solution to this problem would be to bring back completely original bosses, which they had in the first game on the DS. They already had it right in the beginning, and they ruined it with a bunch of reptile children. It's just tragic. Regardless, I love the bosses in the first entry to the series. They were unique, usually fit the theme of the world the player was in, and even had some pretty engaging mechanics, at least for a Mario game that was released in 2006. The funny thing about this entry is that the final boss is probably the worst one in the game. Pretty ironic. The setting of New Super Mario Bros. U is exactly what you would expect. You start in a grassy plain, move into a desert, then there's a snow world, beach world, jungle world, mountain world, same old same old. Plenty of people have voiced their distress on the same world themes being used so often, including myself, and I don't blame them. I'm getting pretty tired of them too. This time around, they spice things up by naming each world after a type of food or drink. How original!
Sure, it's cool that they at least tried to change up the world themes a little bit, but I feel like this could have been another scenario where the designers were limited by the creative directors and producers of the game. I've learned to consider this possibility all the time with Nintendo games after hearing the reasoning behind the newer Paper Mario games lacking original characters and only adopting from the existing Mario universe. Sometimes you can't even blame the development team as a whole, and it's simply the executives of the team holding the game back from greatness with outdated views or ideologies. Moving on though, we should also take a look at the final world of the game, which is Peach's Castle. This time around, it has been captured and occupied by Bowser at the beginning of the game. How original! Jokes aside, this is definitely the best world in the game, albeit very short. It's a good execution of the concept of Peach's Castle being overthrown. I would have loved to see the world fleshed out even more, maybe even including some more interesting levels inside of the castle itself. It actually seems like levels were originally intended inside of the castle, seeing as you enter it to reach the top, but I'm guessing it was scrapped due to time constraints given this was a launch title for the Wii U. But regardless of that, they could have used so many different world themes than the ones we've already seen time and time again. They don't even have to have anything crazy, just something new to the series. They could have an alpine world, a savanna world, an autumn themed world, factory world, temple themed world. I could go on, and those are just simple themes. They could be even more in depth than that. This principle also applies to the themes of individual levels as well. Many levels across Mario U felt exactly the same as the ones before, at least from an aesthetic standpoint, making all the levels blend together and preventing them from being individually memorable. There were some pretty memorable levels though. Obviously there's the mosaic painting level, which only got used once. Nintendo allowed one good looking level and then shoved it under the rug. Nope, you're done, back to generic jungle backgrounds. Other cool levels I somewhat enjoyed were Spinning Star Sky and also the Haunted Ghost Ship, as well as the one level where you climbed up the beanstalk, but that's about it. All the other levels were pretty boring and unmemorable to me. Better yet though, it would be amazing to see each world have a problem that needed to be solved, rather than there just being an arbitrary boss at the end that really isn't even blocking your path forward. Look, you can just walk right past the castle and move on to the next world right here. I'm thinking of an approach similar to Super Mario Odyssey, where once you reach a world, a problem is presented to you by the citizens of that specific area, and you must solve that problem to restore peace and move on. It helps give each world its own identity, and breathes so much more life into the game in the process. You want to solve the problems of the citizens because you see the issue in the kingdom firsthand, and the citizens in turn suffering from it. Now that I've addressed the big stuff, I also want to talk about a few tweaks to the game as a whole that could help it be even better, on top of the modifications I've already mentioned. The first tweak I want to mention is the complete lack of purpose for having lives in this game. 1-ups are all over every single level, the difficulty is extremely low as I previously mentioned, and all on top of that, there's enough coins in the game to pay off the United States national debt. Seriously, they're everywhere. There was a zero possibility I was ever going to get a game over at any point throughout my playthrough. I'll stop my ranting there though, because I've already gone super in depth on the validity of using lives in video games in a previous video. So if you want to hear more about that, I'll link it in the top right corner of the screen right now. However, I do think there is a way to remedy this lives problem. What if the next 2D Mario game adopted the same type of system as Super Mario Odyssey, where the coins you collect go to a universal counter, and every time you die, you lose some of your coins. The currency could then be used to buy special outfits for the player, unlock exclusive levels, or even buy power-ups from a shop. This approach could give coins their value again, and not just be a shiny thing that you collect in the level that loses its purpose before the game even begins. Not to mention getting rid of those pesky lives. Another tweak I'd like to make involves the swimming in this game. The swimming controls are basically the exact same as the very first Mario game to ever release. The only control you have is to press A to swim up very slightly. No other maneuverability is given. It's extremely odd that this was never changed since tons of movement abilities were added to the roster when outside of water, such as mid-air twirling, wall jumping, and triple jumping. But swimming was never even touched. If they wanted to fix this, I would suggest implementing swimming controls similar to the ones used in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Those were by far the best swimming controls I've seen in a 2D platformer, and actually made underwater levels fun. Or, if you didn't want to make swimming that advanced, just make the extra control offered through the frog or penguin suits available all the time. Those already give plenty of maneuverability compared to swimming normally. Either way, it needs to be updated badly. The swimming mechanics in this game make underwater levels extremely unenjoyable, slow, and sometimes even frustrating. And finally, the last tweak I want to mention to New Super Mario Bros. U involves the music, and I'm sure some of you saw this coming. There is so little variety in music across this game that it's not even funny. To put it into perspective, there are 82 levels in the game, but there are only 13 music themes to span across all 82 of those levels. If you divide that out evenly, that means each track was used at least 6 times. But the thing is, they're not even divided out evenly. Some tracks are used way more often than the others, such as the overworld and athletic themes, and some tracks aren't even that different from each other. The overworld and snow themes are basically the exact same song, but with different instruments. Additionally, some of these tracks aren't even original themselves. They straight up stole them from previous games, such as the underground, underwater, jungle, and beach tracks. I don't know, the only thing that I can chalk that up to is laziness. They didn't even remix them, unless you want to count these small hums that were added when you take a baby Yoshi into the level. And no, the tracks aren't bad by any means, they're extremely catchy, but that stopped mattering to me years ago after the tracks were already drilled into my head for the 100th time. Overall, New Super Mario Bros. U is not a bad game, despite all that I've just said, and if it released before all of the relative carbon copies that came before it, it may have been considered pretty good, as it had tons of great callbacks to previous games. But because of that, it comes off as extremely mediocre to the point of where it's almost not even worth playing. However, with the improvements I suggested throughout this video, I feel like the next game could revitalize the reputation for these types of games and bring back the love for 2D Mario, the genre that started it all.